in the opulent halls of Ashford Manor, where rare wines fetch fortunes and secrets simmer beneath silk gowns, a ruthless tycoon raises a glass of Chateau Lavaux, only to collapse in a poisoned gasp. As whispers of murder ripple through the elite, Miss Jane Marple, a quiet spinster with a razor-sharp mind, unravels a web of ambition, revenge, and deceit. From a desperate auctioneer to a proud vintner, a cunning rival to a shadowy stranger, everyone hides a motive, but only one holds the key to a deadly plot. Will Miss Marple's keen eyes pierce the glamour before the killer strikes again? Chapter 1. The Gilded Auction Room. The grand hall of Ashford Manor shimmered with opulence, its high ceilings adorned with frescoes of cherubs and vines, as though the very walls paid homage to the evening's purpose. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, their prisms scattering golden light across the polished mahogany floor. The air carried the faint scent of beeswax and anticipation, mingled with the delicate perfume of wealth. It was the night of the annual Ashford Wine Auction, an event that drew the elite from across England and beyond, their purses heavy and their ambitions sharper still. The promise of rare vintages, bottles whispered about in collectors' circles, had filled the room with a restless energy. Miss Jane Marple sat unobtrusively in a velvet-upholstered chair near the corner, her small, neat figure almost lost among the grandeur. Her black lace shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, and her hands moved with quiet precision, knitting a pale pink scarf that seemed at odds with the evening's extravagance. Yet her eyes, bright and keen as a sparrow's, missed nothing. She had come at the invitation of her old friend, Lady Beatrice Ashford, whose family had owned the manor for generations, and whose cellars housed treasures rivaling those of any European chateau. Beatrice, with her warm laugh and penchant for matchmaking, had insisted Jane attend, claiming the event would amuse her. "You'll see all sorts, Jane," she had said, "and you're so clever at seeing through them." Miss Marple had smiled then, as she did now, knowing that people rarely changed, whether in Saint, Mary Mead, or a manor's gilded hall. The crowd was a tapestry of elegance and ego. Gentlemen in tailored evening suits adjusted their cufflinks, while ladies in silk gowns fanned themselves, their jewels catching the light. At the centre of it all stood the auctioneer, Mr. Percival Thorne, a wiry man with a waxed moustache and a voice that could charm a snake. He paced the raised dais, his gestures theatrical, as he extolled the virtues of the evening's first lot, a 1904 Burgundy of impeccable provenance. His enthusiasm was infectious, and bids flew like sparks, each number climbing higher to gasps and murmurs from the onlookers. Near the front, commanding attention as much by his presence as his reputation, sat Mr. Reginald Carver. A burly man, with a florid complexion and a scowl that seemed etched into his features, Carver was an industrialist whose fortune came from steel, but whose passion lay in wine. His collection was the envy of many, built not only on wealth, but on a ruthless determination to outbid all rivals. Miss Marple had overheard whispers about him as she entered, tales of his temper, his grudges, and his habit of gloating over defeated competitors. "He'd sell his soul for a bottle," one guest had muttered, and Miss Marple, with her knack for village parallels, thought of old Mr. Griggs, who hoarded his prize roses with the same ferocity. Beside the dais stood Madame Elise Dubois, the vintner whose 1928 Chateau Lavaux was the evening's crown jewel. A striking woman in her 40s, with raven hair swept into an elegant chignon, she wore a deep burgundy gown that seemed to echo the hue of her wine. Her posture was proud, almost defiant, as she watched the proceedings with a faint smile. Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened around her fan when Carver's name was mentioned. There was history there, she thought, though whether of business or something deeper, she could not yet say. At the back of the room, half hidden by a marble pillar, stood a man introduced only as Mr. Victor Gray. His fedora was tilted low, casting a shadow over his sharp features, and his dark overcoat seemed out of place among the evening's finery. He spoke little, his eyes darting from bidder to bidder, lingering longest on Carver. Miss Marple, with her gift for noticing the unnoticed, saw how his hand rested near his pocket, as if guarding something, or perhaps ready to use it. He was not here for the wine, she suspected, but for what, she could only guess. The bidding for the Château Lavaux began, and the room hushed. Thorne, with a flourish, presented the bottle, its label pristine despite its age. A wine of unparalleled depth, he declared, a symphony in a bottle, crafted by Madame Dubois herself. The vintner inclined her head, accepting the applause with grace. Carver, impatient, raised his paddle, his bid bold and immediate. Others followed, including Mrs. Lydia Harcourt, a rival bidder whose sharp features and sharper wit had already drawn Miss Marple's attention. Lydia's bids were precise, almost aggressive, and her eyes never left Carver, glinting with something more than competition. Thorne offered a tasting to the top bidders, a ritual to whet their appetites. Footmen circulated with crystal glasses, each filled with a measure of the Château Lavaux. Carver, ever the showman, stood to receive his, holding the glass aloft to inspect its ruby depths. "Let's see if it's worth the fuss," he said loudly, his voice carrying a challenge. He sipped, swirled, and sipped again. Then, with a sudden choked gasp, he clutched his throat. His glass fell, shattering on the floor, and his body followed, crumpling in a heap as the room erupted in screams. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused, her hands still as she watched the chaos unfold. Footmen rushed forward, guests recoiled, and Lady Ashford's voice rose above the din, calling for order. But Miss Marple's mind was already at work, sifting through the faces, the gestures, the fleeting glances she had catalogued all evening. Someone in this gilded room had wanted Reginald Carver dead, and as she folded her knitting and rose to offer her quiet assistance, she knew she would find them. Chapter 2. A Matter of Poison. The grand hall of Ashford Manor, so recently alive with the sparkle of chandeliers and the hum of eager voices, had transformed into a tableau of shock and suspicion. The shattered remnants of Reginald Carver's wineglass lay scattered across the polished floor, glinting like cruel stars under the flickering light. Guests stood frozen, their faces a gallery of horror, curiosity, and, Miss Jane Marple noted with her keen, quiet gaze, a few traces of something less innocent. The air, once fragrant with anticipation, now carried the sharp tang of fear, overlaid with the faint, lingering bouquet of the spilled Château Lavaux. Miss Marple remained in her corner, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, her small figure almost invisible amidst the chaos. She had seen death before, too often perhaps for a spinster from St. Mary Mead, but each encounter sharpened her sense of human nature's darker corners. As the crowd parted, whispering and craning their necks, "Doctor!" Ernest Haywood, a local physician who had been among the bidders, knelt beside Carver's body. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking for a pulse, lifting an eyelid, and then, with a grave shake of his head, he rose to his feet. "He's dead, Doctor," Haywood announced, his voice steady but low, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a swell of panicked voices. Lady Beatrice Ashford, her face pale but composed, stepped forward, her silk gown rustling as she raised a hand for silence. "Please, everyone, remain calm," she said, her tone carrying the authority of one accustomed to command. "We must wait for the authorities. No one is to leave the hall." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and unblinking, darted from face to face. She saw Percival Thorne, the auctioneer, clutching the edge of the dais, his waxed moustache trembling as he stared at the body. Madame Elise Dubois, the vintner, stood rigid, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles gleamed white against her burgundy gown. Mr. Victor Gray, the enigmatic stranger, had retreated further into the shadows, his fedora now pulled lower. But Miss Marple caught the glint of his eyes, watchful and guarded. Mrs. Lydia Harcourt, the rival bidder, stood apart, her lips pressed into a thin line, her expression unreadable, save for a faint flicker of satisfaction, or was it relief, that passed too quickly to be certain. Within minutes, the distant wail of a siren announced the arrival of the police. Inspector Harold Crane, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face as unyielding as granite, strode into the hall, followed by 2 constables and a wiry young sergeant named Gibbs. Crane's presence was like a cold wind, silencing the room as he surveyed the scene. His eyes lingered on Carver's crumpled form, then moved to the shattered glass, and finally to the crowd, as if measuring each guest's potential for guilt. "Everyone, stay where you are," he saw, his voice clipped and authoritative. "Sergeant Gibbs, secure the exits. No one leaves until we've spoken to them." He knelt beside Doctor Haywood, exchanging a few low words, then stood and addressed the room again. "I understand this is distressing, but we need to establish what had happened. Dr. Haywood, your assessment?" "Strychnine, I'd wager, Doctor." Haywood replied, adjusting his spectacles. "The symptoms, convulsions, the rigidity, the speed of it, all point to that. A post-mortem will confirm, but I've seen it before. The poison was in the wine he drank, no question." A murmur swept through the crowd, and Madame Dubois stepped forward, her face flushed with indignation. "Impossible!" she cried, her French accent sharpening her words. "My Chateau Lavaux is flawless. I oversaw every step of its creation. To suggest it was poisoned is an insult to my craft." Inspector Crane raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "We'll test the bottle, madam, and the glass, or what's left of it. For now, I need statements from everyone who was near Mr. Carver, or the wine Miss Marple, though unnoticed by the inspector, listened intently. She had a way of fading into the background, her unassuming presence allowing her to observe what others missed. She noted the way Thorne's hands shook as he wiped his brow with a handkerchief, the defensive set of Madame Dubois' shoulders, and the way Mr. Gray's fingers twitched toward his pocket before he caught himself. Mrs. Harcourt, meanwhile, had moved closer to Lady Ashford, whispering something that made Beatrice's lips tighten. Inspector Crane began his interrogations with Percival Thorne, who was still hovering near the dais, looking as though he might bolt if given the chance. "Mr. Thorne," Crane said, his notebook open, You poured the wine for the tasting, correct? Yes, yes, Thorne stammered, his theatrical poise crumbling. I poured from the bottle into the glasses, as I always do. I handed one to Mr. Carver myself, but I swear, Inspector, I did nothing to it. The bottle was sealed when Madame Dubois brought it up from the cellar. And you didn't leave the dais at any point? Crane pressed. No, I was there the whole time, in full view, Thorne said, his voice rising. Ask anyone. I couldn't have tampered with anything. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her mind turning over Thorne's words. He was frightened, that much was clear. But was it the fear of a guilty man, or one caught in a trap he didn't understand? She thought of Mr. Jenkins, the grocer in St. Mary Mead, who had once been accused of short-changing customers. His protests had been loud, his hands trembling just like Thorne's. But it was guilt, not innocence, that had made him sweat. Yet Thorne's fear seemed different, less calculated, more visceral. Crane moved on to Madame Dubois, who met his gaze with a mixture of defiance and distress. Madame, he began, you provided the wine. Can you vouch for its purity? Absolutely, she said, her voice steady despite the flush in her cheeks. The Chateau Lavaux is my life's work. Every bottle is sealed and stored under my supervision. I brought it to the manor myself this morning, and it remained in the cellar until the auction began. No one could have tampered with it. And your relationship with Mr. Carver? Crane asked, his tone neutral but probing. Madame Dubois hesitated, her eyes narrowing. He was difficult, she admitted. He insulted my wines at a London auction last year, called them overpriced grape juice. But I would never stoop to murder over such a slight. My reputation speaks for itself, Miss Marple's needles, though still in her lap, seemed to click in her mind. She knew the sting of pride wounded, how it could fester. In her village, Mrs. Price had once spread rumours about a rival's baking, and the fallout had been fierce, though thankfully not fatal. Madame Dubois' pride was of a grander scale, but the principle was the same. Still, the vintner's outrage seemed genuine, and Miss Marple doubted she would risk her legacy by poisoning her own creation. Next, Crane turned to Mr. Victor Gray, who had emerged from the shadows with a reluctant air. Mr. Gray, Crane said, you're not a regular at these auctions, I'm told. What brought you here? I'm a wine enthusiast, Gray replied, his voice smooth but guarded, his accent clipped and vaguely metropolitan. I heard about the Chateau Lavaux and wanted to see it for myself. I was just observing, Inspector. I didn't know Carver personally. Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing, the way Gray's eyes avoided meeting Crane's directly. He was polished, but not too polished, like a man who had practiced his story but not perfected it. She thought of young Tommy Lane in St. Mary Mead, who had once claimed to be just passing by when caught near a stolen bicycle. Gray's evasiveness had the same quality, a truth stretched thin. Finally, Crane approached Mrs. Lydia Harcourt, who stood with her arms crossed, her emerald necklace catching the light. Mrs. Harcourt, he said, you were bidding against Mr. Carver. Any bad blood between you? Lydia laughed, a sharp, crystalline sound. Bad blood? Inspector Reginald Carver was a bore, but I hardly needed to kill him to beat him. I was across the room when he collapsed bidding on the Lavaux. Dozens of people saw me. Yet you were near the wine table earlier, Crane said, his eyes narrowing. Several witnesses mentioned it. Lydia's smile didn't falter, but her fingers tightened on her clutch. "I was adjusting my shawl," she said. "The table was crowded." I didn't touch the glasses. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Lydia. The woman's confidence was formidable, but there was a brittleness to it, like porcelain that might crack under pressure. She reminded Miss Marple of Mrs. Elton, the vicar's wife, who could charm a room but faltered when her secrets were exposed. Lydia's rivalry with Carver was no secret. She had lost several prize bottles to him in past auctions, and her ambition to dominate the wine world was as sharp as her wit. As Crane continued his questioning, Miss Marple sipped her tea, brought by a trembling footman who seemed eager to escape the room. She watched the interplay of fear and defiance, noting the small details that others overlooked. The way Thorne kept glancing at Lady Ashford as if seeking rescue. The way Madame Dubois' fan snapped shut when Carver's name was mentioned. The way Gray's hand hovered near his pocket, only to drop when he noticed her watching. And Lydia? Lydia's eyes had flickered toward the broken glass, just once, but it was enough. The inspector concluded his initial interviews, announcing that the police would test the wine bottle, the glass shards, and any other evidence from the scene. "We'll need to speak to everyone again," he said. "For now, remain in the manor. My men will be watching." As the crowd dispersed to the drawing room, under the watchful eyes of the constables, Miss Marple remained seated, her mind sifting through the evening's events. The poison, Dr. Hayward had said, was strychnine, fast, tasteless, and deadly. It had been in Carver's glass, not the bottle, which meant the killer had acted swiftly, in the brief window between the pouring and the tasting. The hall had been crowded, the glasses accessible to many, but only one had been poisoned. That required nerve, precision, and motive. Miss Marple thought of her village, where motives were often simple: jealousy, greed, revenge, but no less deadly for it. Here, among the glittering elite, the stakes were higher, but the human heart was the same. Thorne's fear suggested debts or threats, perhaps tied to Carver's influence. Madame Dubois' pride could have been pushed too far by Carver's insults. Gray's secrecy hinted at a hidden agenda, and Lydia's ambition burned bright enough to consume anything in its path. She rose, her movements slow and deliberate, and approached Lady Ashford, who was speaking quietly with Dr. Hayward. "Beatrice, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear. "Might I have a word with the staff? They see so much, you know, and say so little." Beatrice, still shaken, nodded. "Of course, Jane." Anything to help Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with quiet purpose. The gilded hall held its secrets, but secrets, she knew, had a way of unravelling when you tugged at the right thread, and she intended to find it. Chapter 3. The Auctioneer's Secret. The morning after the tragedy at Ashford Manor dawned grey and heavy, the sky outside the tall windows draped in a mist that clung to the estate's sprawling lawns. Inside, the atmosphere was no less oppressive. The grand hall, so vibrant the previous evening, now felt like a stage abandoned after a grim performance. The police had cordoned off the area where Reginald Carver had fallen, and a faint chalk outline marked the spot, a stark reminder of the night's horror. Guests confined to the manor by Inspector Crane's orders moved restlessly through the drawing rooms and corridors, their whispers like the rustle of dead leaves. Miss Jane Marple sat in a quiet alcove of the library, a room of dark oak shelves and leather-bound volumes that smelled faintly of polish and time. Her knitting lay in her lap, the pale pink scarf growing imperceptibly as her needles clicked with a rhythm that seemed to steady her thoughts. She had chosen this spot deliberately, for the library's high windows overlooked the gravel drive where police constables came and went, and its position near the main staircase allowed her to overhear snatches of conversation from passing guests. Miss Marple had always found that the best way to understand people was to listen when they thought no one was watching. Her mind was occupied with Percival Thorne, the auctioneer whose trembling hands and pallid face had caught her attention the night before. His fear had been palpable, not merely the shock of witnessing death, but something deeper, more personal. She had seen that kind of fear before, in the eyes of Mrs. Carter's nephew in St. Mary Mead, when he'd been caught pilfering from the church poor box to settle a gambling debt. Thorne's agitation suggested a similar burden, a secret that weighed heavily and made him vulnerable. She had arranged to speak with him, using her gentle, unassuming manner to secure an invitation. Lady Ashford, ever obliging, had sent a footman to fetch Thorne, and now he entered the library, his usual theatrical flourish replaced by a nervous twitch. He wore a dark suit, slightly creased, and his moustache, so meticulously waxed the previous evening, drooped as if mirroring his spirits. He glanced around, as if expecting Inspector Crane to emerge from behind a bookcase, before settling into a chair opposite Miss Marple. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice soft and warm, like a favourite aunt inviting confidences. "I do hope you're managing under these dreadful circumstances." Thorne managed a weak smile, his fingers fidgeting with a loose thread on his cuff. "As well as can be expected, Miss Marple. It's a terrible thing, what happened to Carver. Terrible. Indeed," she agreed, her needles pausing briefly. "Such a shock, and at such a splendid event. You must feel it keenly, being the auctioneer. So much responsibility, ensuring everything goes smoothly." Thorne's eyes darted to hers, then away. "Yes, well, I do my best. It's not easy, you know, managing these affairs. So many expectations." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her gaze gentle but unyielding. "I can imagine. And Mr. Carver, I understand, was a formidable presence. I've heard he could be quite demanding." Thorne's face tightened, and he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Demanding doesn't cover it, Miss Marple." The man was a tyrant. He didn't just bid, he bullied, always had to have his way, no matter the cost to others. She tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Did he make things difficult for you, perhaps?" "I've known men like that in my village. Men who think their wealth gives them power over everyone." Thorne hesitated, his fingers now twisting the handkerchief he'd pulled from his pocket. He did make things difficult," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Carver had a way of getting what he wanted. He'd been pressuring me for weeks before the auction, you see. Wanted me to favour him in the bidding." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly, though her face remained serene. "Favour him? How extraordinary. Do you mean he asked you to manipulate the auction?" Thorne's eyes widened, and he shook his head quickly. "Not manipulate exactly. Just ensure certain lots went his way. He said he'd make it worth my while, clear some debts I owe." "I refused, of course. I have my reputation to consider." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured, her tone soothing but her mind alert. Debts, she thought. Debts were a powerful motive, as she'd seen with Mr. Harrow, the St. Mary Mead tailor who'd nearly ruined himself betting on horses. And these debts, she continued gently, they must weigh heavily. It's so easy to fall into such traps, isn't it? Thorn's face flushed, and he looked away, his handkerchief now a crumpled ball in his hands. They're not my fault, he said defensively. A few bad investments, some unfortunate loans. Carver knew about them, though I don't know how. He said he could help, but only if I did as he asked. When I refused, he got angry, threatened to ruin me. Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet rhythm, the soft click-click, a counterpoint to Thorn's agitation. How dreadful, she said, to be threatened by such a man. And yet you stood your ground. That took courage. Thorn's shoulders sagged, as if her words had lifted a small part of his burden. I tried, he said, but now, with him dead, and the police asking questions, I'm afraid they'll think I had something to do with it. I was the one who poured the wine, after all. Yes, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, but you poured it in front of everyone, didn't you? And the glasses were on the table for some time before the tasting. Anyone could have tampered with them. Thorn nodded eagerly, seizing on her words. Exactly. I was on the dais the whole time, in full view. I couldn't have done anything without being seen, but the police, they keep looking at me. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her expression remained kind. The police must look at everyone, Mr. Thorn. It's their way. But tell me, did you notice anything unusual before the tasting? Anyone near the glasses, perhaps, or behaving oddly? Thorn frowned, his brow furrowing as he thought. It was so busy, he said. People were milling about, bidding, talking. I saw Mrs. Harcourt near the table at one point. She dropped her fan and bent to pick it up. And that Mr. Gray, he was always lurking, never far from the action. But I didn't see anything specific. I was too focused on the auction. Miss Marple nodded, storing the information away. Of course, she said, you had a great deal to manage. Thank you, Mr. Thorn, for being so candid. It's such a comfort to know the truth, isn't it? Thorn managed a shaky smile, clearly relieved to have unburdened himself, however slightly. As he rose to leave, Miss Marple's gaze followed him, her mind turning over his words. Debts and threats were a dangerous combination, she knew, and Thorn's access to the wine-glasses made him a plausible suspect. Yet his fear seemed too raw, too unpolished, to be the mask of a murderer. A guilty man, she thought, would have been more careful, more rehearsed. Still, she would not dismiss him yet. People, as she often remarked, could surprise you. As Thorn departed, Miss Marple remained in the library, her eyes drifting to the window where a police car was pulling away, likely carrying evidence to be tested. She thought of the strychnine, so precise in its delivery, and the glass that had held it. Someone had acted with daring, slipping the poison into Carver's glass under the noses of a crowded room. It was a bold act, but not reckless, calculated, like the moves of Mrs. Fletcher's nephew and saint. Mary Mead, who had planned a theft with meticulous care, only to be undone by a forgotten glove. She rose, tucking her knitting into her bag, and decided to seek out Lady Ashford. Beatrice would know more about Thorn's background, perhaps even the nature of his debts. As she made her way to the drawing-room, she passed a group of guests whispering about Carver's death, their voices a mix of fear and fascination. One mentioned a rumour that Carver had enemies beyond the auction room, business rivals, scorned partners, even a disgruntled servant. Miss Marple filed this away, knowing that gossip, while often exaggerated, could hold kernels of truth. In the drawing-room, she found Lady Ashford seated by a roaring fire, her face drawn but composed as she spoke with a young constable. Miss Marple waited patiently, her presence barely noticed, until Beatrice excused the officer and turned to her friend. "Jane, you're a marvel for staying so calm," Beatrice said, managing a tired smile. "This is all so ghastly. The police are everywhere, and the guests are beside themselves." "It's a trying time," Miss Marple agreed, settling into a chair. "I was just speaking with Mr. Thorne. He seems terribly shaken. I understand he's had some financial troubles." Beatrice's eyes widened slightly, then softened with understanding. "You've been sleuthing already, haven't you?" "Yes, poor Percival's been in a bind. He's a dear man, but not the best with money. I heard he owes quite a sum to some rather unpleasant people in London. Carver was mixed up in it somehow. Business dealings, I think. But Percival's harmless, surely." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her expression non-committal. "People are rarely as harmless as they seem," she said, "but I'm sure you're right about Mr. Thorne. Tell me, Beatrice, who else knew about his troubles?" Beatrice frowned, thinking. It wasn't a secret exactly. Carver made no effort to hide his influence over Percival. I overheard him boasting about it to Mrs. Harcourt once, saying he had Percival in his pocket. She didn't seem surprised. Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her face remained serene. "Mrs. Harcourt," she murmured. "She's a formidable woman, isn't she?" So ambitious, Beatrice nodded. "Oh, yes. She and Carver were always at odds, snapping up the same bottles at auctions. She's determined to have the finest collection in England, and Carver was her biggest obstacle." Miss Marple thanked her friend and rose, her mind buzzing with new connections. Thorne's debts, Carver's threats, and Lydia Harcourt's ambition formed a web that was growing more intricate by the hour. As she left the drawing-room, she caught sight of Mr. Grey in the corridor, his head bent in conversation with a footman who looked uneasy. She paused unnoticed and watched as Grey slipped something into the footman's hand before hurrying away. The thread, Miss Marple thought, was there. She only needed to keep tugging. Chapter 4. The Vintner's Pride. The mist that had cloaked Ashford Manor's grounds began to lift by mid-morning, revealing the estate's manicured gardens and the distant glint of the lake. Inside, however, the air remained thick with suspicion, as if the very walls of the manor absorbed the unease of its occupants. Miss Jane Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human behaviour, moved through the corridors with her quiet, purposeful grace. Her small black bag, containing her knitting and a few personal effects, swung gently at her side as she made her way to the guest wing, where Madame Elise Dubois had taken up temporary residence. The vintner's quarters were in a secluded corner of the manor, a suite of rooms adorned with tapestries and heavy velvet curtains that seemed to muffle the world outside. Miss Marple knocked softly, and the door was opened by a young maid who, after a moment's hesitation, ushered her inside. Madame Dubois stood by a tall window, her silhouette sharp against the pale light filtering through the glass. Her burgundy gown had been replaced by a simpler dress of deep green, but her posture remained regal, her dark hair still swept into an impeccable chignon. She turned as Miss Marple entered, her expression a mixture of weariness and defiance. "Miss Marple, is it?" Madame Dubois said, her French accent lending a musical quality to her words. "Lady Ashford mentioned you." "A friend with a curious mind," she said. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth. Dear Beatrice is too kind. I'm merely an old woman who enjoys a bit of conversation, especially in such trying times. May I sit? Of course. Madame Dubois gestured to a plush armchair near a small table set with a silver tea service. The maid, with a nervous glance, retreated to the doorway, leaving the two women alone. Miss Marple settled into the chair, her hands resting lightly on her bag, and studied the vintner with her usual, unobtrusive scrutiny. The room was a reflection of Madame Dubois' character, elegant, precise, and proud. A small desk held papers neatly stacked, their edges aligned as if measured with a ruler. A single bottle of wine, unlabelled, perhaps a personal reserve, stood on a sideboard, its darker glass catching the light. Miss Marple noted the care with which everything was arranged, much like the garden of Mrs. Bantry in St. Mary Mead, where every rose was pruned to perfection. Such order, she knew, often hid a fierce need for control. I imagine this has been a dreadful shock for you, Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but probing. Your beautiful Chateau Lavaux, so celebrated, and now caught up in this tragedy. Madame Dubois' lips tightened, and she turned back to the window, her hands clasped behind her. It is an outrage, she said, her voice low but fierce. My wine is my life, Miss Marple. Every bottle is a piece of my soul, crafted with care over years. To have it accused of carrying poison, it is not just an insult, it is a violation. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of deep sympathy. I can only imagine how painful that must be. In my village, we have a baker, Mrs. Hemsley, who takes such pride in her scones. If someone suggested they were tainted, she'd be heartbroken. But you're certain the wine was pure when it left your hands? Certain? Madame Dubois spun to face her, her dark eyes flashing. I am more than certain. I brought the Chateau Lavaux to the manor myself. The bottles were sealed, locked in a case, and stored in the cellar until the auction. I inspected them before they were brought to the hall. No one could have tampered with them without breaking the seals, and those were intact. Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze steady but kind, and yet the poison was in Mr. Carver's glass, not the bottle, or so the police believe. That must be a relief in a way, knowing your wine wasn't at fault. Madame Dubois' shoulders relaxed slightly, though her expression remained guarded. A relief, yes, but it does not erase the stain on my name. People will talk. They always do. They'll say, Dubois' wine killed a man. It could ruin me. Miss Marple's needles, though still in her bag, seemed to click in her mind as she considered the vintner's words. Pride was a powerful force, as she'd seen with old Mr. Grayson, in St. Mary Mead, who'd nearly bankrupted himself to keep his shop's reputation spotless. People can be cruel, she said softly, but the truth has a way of coming out. Tell me, madame, did you know Mr. Carver well? The vintner's face darkened, and she moved to the table, pouring tea with a hand that betrayed a slight tremor. Well enough, she said curtly. He was a collector, one of many. But he was not a man I liked. He had no respect for the art of wine, only for owning it. He treated my work like a trophy, not a creation. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea, her fingers delicate on the saucer. I've heard he could be unkind. Someone mentioned he insulted your wine at a previous auction. That must have been terribly upsetting. Madame Dubois' eyes narrowed, and she set her cup down with a sharp clink. Upsetting? It was infuriating. Last year, at a London auction, he stood up in front of everyone and called my 1925 vintage overrated swill. Swill! My wine, which won awards in Paris, dismissed like cheap table wine. He did it to drive down the bids, to buy it for less. It was a calculated insult, and it cost me dearly." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed. "How dreadful," she said, "to attack your work so publicly. It reminds me of a farmer in my village, Mr. Hodge, who once accused a rival of selling spoiled milk. It wasn't true, but the damage was done. Did Mr. Carver ever apologize?" "Apologize?" Madame Dubois gave a bitter laugh. "That man apologized to no one. He revelled in his power. After the auction, he bought the lot anyway, as if to mock me further. I saw him last night, smirking as he raised his glass. I thought, let him taste it and see how wrong he was. And then," her voice faltered, and she looked away, her fingers tightening around her cup. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the flicker of emotion, anger, yes, but also a hint of fear. "And then he collapsed," she finished gently. "It must have been a shock seeing it happen so suddenly." "It was," Madame Dubois said, her voice quieter now. "I thought at first he was drunk or ill." "But poison? No, I cannot believe it. Not my wine." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind sifting through the vintner's words. The anger was real, as was the pride, but the fear seemed out of place, like a note struck off-key. Was it fear of ruin, or something more? She thought of Mrs. Langley, a St. Mary Mead widow who'd once hidden her son's misdeeds out of love, her fear betraying her long before her words did. Madame Dubois was protecting something, her reputation certainly, but perhaps something else. "Tell me," Miss Marple said, setting her cup down, "who else had access to the wine before the tasting?" "The cellar, I understand, is quite secure." Madame Dubois nodded, her composure returning. "It is." "Only I and Lady Ashford's steward, Mr. Benton, have keys. I brought the bottles up myself, just before the auction began. They were never out of my sight until they reached the hall, and even then they were on the dais, under Mr. Thorne's watch. And the glasses?" Miss Marple asked, her tone light, as if the question were an afterthought. "The glasses?" Madame Dubois frowned. "They were already on the table when I arrived with the bottles. The footman set them out, I suppose. I didn't pay much attention. My focus was on the wine." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged but her mind alert. The glasses, then, were the weak link, accessible to anyone in the crowded hall. She thought of the moment before the tasting, when the room had been a whirl of movement, guests mingling, footmen circulating, bidders vying for position. It would have taken only a second to slip something into Carver's glass, but it required nerve and opportunity. "You've been most helpful, madame," Miss Marple said, rising with a small smile. "I won't take more of your time. I'm sure the police will find the truth, and your wine will be cleared of any suspicion." Madame Dubois inclined her head, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I hope you are right." As Miss Marple left the suite, she paused in the corridor, her gaze lingering on the door. Madame Dubois's pride was a fortress, but fortresses could hide cracks. The insult from Carver had cut deeply, and while Miss Marple doubted the vintner would poison her own wine, she knew that pride could drive people to desperate acts. She thought of Mrs. Price-Inson, Mary Mead, who had once sabotaged a rival's garden out of spite, only to regret it when her own roses suffered. Could Madame Dubois have acted in a moment of rage, only to be horrified by the consequences? She made her way back to the main house, her steps slow and deliberate, The manor was quieter now, the guests subdued under the weight of the police presence. As she passed the drawing-room, she caught sight of Mrs. Lydia Harcourt speaking with Lady Ashford, her gestures animated but her voice low. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Lydia had been near the wine table, Thorne had said, and her rivalry with Carver was no secret. The web was growing tighter, and Miss Marple felt the tug of another thread. She resolved to speak with Inspector Crane later, to learn if the police had found anything in the cellar or among the glass shards. For now, she returned to her alcove in the library, her knitting resumed, and her mind sifting through the morning's revelations. Madame Dubois' pride was a motive, but not the only one. The auctioneer's debts, the stranger's secrecy, and the rival's ambition all wove together, and somewhere in that pattern lay the truth. Chapter 5. The Mysterious Guest. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Ashford Manor, casting long shadows across the polished floors and lending a sombre hue to the once vibrant corridors. The guests, still confined to the estate by Inspector Crane's orders, moved with the restless air of caged birds, their conversations hushed and their glances wary. Miss Jane Marple, however, found the quiet conducive to her purpose. She had always believed that secrets, like dust, settled in the stillness, waiting for a careful hand to sweep them into view. Her target now was Mr. Victor Gray, the enigmatic stranger whose elusive presence at the auction had piqued her curiosity from the start. Miss Marple had learned, through a discreet inquiry to Lady Ashford's housekeeper, that Mr. Gray had been seen in the manor's gardens earlier that day, pacing alone under the ancient yews. She made her way there now, her black shawl draped over her shoulders, her steps soft but deliberate on the gravel path. The gardens were a masterpiece of design, with neatly trimmed hedges and rose beds that reminded her of Mrs. Bantry's pride and joy in St. Mary Mead. Yet the beauty was overshadowed by the weight of recent events, and the air carried a chill that had little to do with the autumn breeze. She found Mr. Gray near a marble fountain, its gentle trickle a counterpoint to his restless movements. He stood with his back to her, his fedora tilted low, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his dark overcoat. The cigarette case she had noticed the previous evening gleamed briefly as he shifted, catching the weak sunlight. Miss Marple approached with her usual unassuming air, her small figure almost blending into the garden's muted tones. "Good afternoon, Mr. Gray," she said, her voice gentle and slightly tremulous, as if she were merely an elderly woman seeking company. "Such a lovely garden, isn't it? I find a walk can do wonders for clearing the mind." Gray turned sharply, his sharp features tightening for a moment before he forced a thin smile. "Miss Marple, I believe," he said, his accent clipped and polished, though with a faint waver that suggested it was not entirely natural. "Yes, the gardens are fine. I needed some air after everything." "Quite understandable," she replied, settling onto a nearby bench and gesturing for him to join her. "Such a shocking affair, poor Mr. Carver's death. It must be unsettling for someone like yourself, new to these circles." Gray hesitated, then sat, his posture stiff. "I'm not entirely new," he said carefully. "I've an interest in wine, and the Ashford auction is renowned. I came to observe, nothing more." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her expression remained one of mild curiosity. "An observer? How fascinating! In my village we have a young man, Tommy Lane, who likes to watch the cricket matches but never plays. He says he learns more that way. Do you find observing auctions so instructive?" Gray's smile flickered, and he adjusted his hat as if to shield his eyes from her gaze. "You could say that. The wine world is complex. It's not just about the bottles, but the people, their rivalries, their ambitions." She nodded, her hands resting lightly on her bag, where her knitting lay hidden. "Oh, indeed. People are always the most interesting part, aren't they? Mr. Carver, I gather, was quite a figure in those rivalries. Did you know him at all?" "Not personally," Gray said quickly, his fingers brushing the edge of his cigarette case. "I'd heard of him, of course. A man like Carver leaves a trail, stories of his deals, his temper, but I had no business with him." Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze soft but piercing. "How curious. You see, I thought I noticed you watching him rather closely last night, during the auction. But perhaps I was mistaken. My eyes aren't what they used to be." Gray's jaw tightened, and for a moment his composure slipped, revealing a flash of unease. "You're observant, Miss Marple," he said, his tone carrying a hint of wariness. "I suppose I was curious about him." Everyone was. He dominated the room, didn't he? "He did," she agreed, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "Such a forceful presence. It's no wonder people noticed him, and perhaps resented him. I've seen it in my village, you know, with men like Mr. Griggs, who always had to have the best roses. It made enemies, though none so drastic as this. Of course," Gray gave a short laugh, "but it lacked warmth. Enemies, yes. Carver had plenty, I'd wager. But I'm just a bystander, Miss Marple. I don't get involved in such things." She smiled, her expression one of gentle understanding, though her mind was racing. His evasiveness reminded her of young Mr. Harrow in St. Mary Mead, who had once claimed to be just passing through when caught near a broken shop window. Gray's story was too smooth, too practiced, and the cigarette case in his pocket nagged at her memory. She recalled the crest she'd glimpsed, a lion and a star, faintly familiar from an old newspaper article about a disgraced noble family, the Greystones, whose heir had vanished after a financial scandal. Could Victor Gray be connected? The initials VG on the case suggested it, but she needed more. "Tell me, mister." "Gray," she said, her tone as light as if she were discussing the weather. "How did you come to hear of the auction?" "It's not widely advertised, I understand, being such an exclusive affair." Gray shifted, his fingers tightening around the cigarette case before he caught himself. "A friend in London mentioned it," he said vaguely. "Said it was the place to see rare wines. I've always been drawn to unique opportunities." Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, though her mind catalogued the hesitation in his voice. "How fortunate for you to be here, then," she said. "Though I suppose it's less fortunate now, with the police asking so many questions. They're very thorough, aren't they? Always looking for the smallest details." Gray's eyes flicked to hers, and for a moment she saw a calculating glint, as if he were weighing how much she knew. "They're doing their job," he said, his voice flat. "But I've nothing to hide." "I was at the back of the room when Carver collapsed. Didn't go near the wine table." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "It was such a crowded evening, wasn't it? So many people moving about. I dare say it would be easy to miss something or someone." Slipping through the chaos, Gray stood abruptly, his movements jerky. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I should return to the house." "The police may want to speak with me again, certainly," she said, rising with her usual slow grace. Thank you for indulging an old woman's chatter. I do hope we'll speak again." As Gray walked away, his pace brisk, Miss Marple watched him go, her eyes lingering on the cigarette case as it disappeared into his pocket. She made a mental note to ask Lady Ashford about the guest list. How had Gray secured an invitation, and who had vouched for him? His claim to be a mere enthusiast rang hollow, like the excuses of Mrs. Elton's nephew in St. Mary Mead, who pretended to be a scholar while pilfering from the church library. She lingered in the garden a moment longer, her gaze drifting to the fountain, where the water's steady trickle seemed to echo the rhythm of her thoughts. Gray's secrecy was a thread in the web, distinct from Thorne's fear, Madame Dubois' pride, and Lydia Harcourt's ambition. His furtive glances at the auction, his reluctance to share his past, and that telltale cigarette case all pointed to a man with something to conceal. Was he a hired hand, a bystander with an agenda, or something else entirely? As she turned back toward the manor, Miss Marple caught sight of a young footman hurrying across the lawn, his face pale and his hands stuffed into his pockets. She recognized him as the one she'd seen speaking with Gray the previous day when something had changed hands. The footman glanced over his shoulder as if sensing her gaze, then quickened his pace. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. St. Mary Mead. She'd learned that servants often saw what others missed, and this young man's unease suggested he knew more than he'd told the police. She resolved to speak with him later, perhaps through Lady Ashford's housekeeper, who had a knack for coaxing confidences from the staff. For now, she returned to the manor, her mind sifting through the morning's conversation. Gray's guarded answers, his fleeting moment of unease, and the crest on his cigarette case formed a puzzle that was far from complete. But Miss Marple was patient. In her village, she had unravelled mysteries by following the smallest clues: a dropped handkerchief, a misspoken word, a glance that lingered too long. Here, in the grandeur of Ashford Manor, the principles were the same. As she entered the library, she saw Inspector Crane speaking with Sergeant Gibbs near the fireplace, their voices low but urgent. She paused, pretending to adjust her shawl, and caught a snippet of their conversation. The glass shards, traces of strychnine, no fingerprints but a smudge. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. The smudge, she thought, was another thread, one that might lead her closer to the truth. She settled into her alcove, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm, and let her mind wander over the suspects. Thorne's debts, Madame Dubois' pride, Gray's secrecy, and Lydia Harcourt's ambition all wove together, but the pattern was still unclear. Mr. Gray, with his shadowed past and guarded demeanour, was a piece that didn't quite fit. Yet. As she knitted, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of the chase, the quiet certainty that the truth, like a dropped stitch, would eventually reveal itself. Chapter 6. The rival's ambition. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Ashford Manor, softening the stark lines of its stone facade, but doing little to ease the tension within. The guests, still under Inspector Crane's watchful eye, had retreated to various corners of the estate, their conversations a low hum of speculation and unease. Miss Jane Marple, ever observant, had chosen the drawing-room as her vantage point, a spacious chamber adorned with gilt-framed portraits and heavy brocade curtains. She sat near the fire, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet rhythm, the pale pink scarf growing steadily in her lap. The room was a hub of activity, with clusters of guests exchanging hushed theories about Reginald Carver's death, and Miss Marple's unassuming presence allowed her to listen without drawing attention. Her thoughts were fixed on Mrs. Lydia Harcourt, the rival bidder whose sharp wit and sharper ambition had marked her as a figure of interest from the start. Lydia's confidence at the auction, her fleeting look of satisfaction when Carver collapsed, and her proximity to the wine table, mentioned by Percival Thorne, had woven a thread of suspicion that Miss Marple was eager to tug. She had seen women like Lydia before, St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Elton, the vicar's wife, whose charm masked a ruthless determination to outshine her rivals, came to mind. Ambition, Miss Marple knew, could be as potent a motive as greed or revenge, and Lydia's rivalry with Carver was no secret. As if summoned by her thoughts, Lydia entered the drawing-room, her emerald necklace catching the firelight as she moved with the grace of a woman accustomed to command. She was dressed in a tailored navy dress, its simplicity a deliberate contrast to the flamboyance of the previous evening, yet her presence dominated the room. She paused to exchange pleasantries with a group of guests, her laughter bright but calculated, before her gaze fell on Miss Marple. For a moment their eyes met, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of curiosity, or perhaps wariness, before Lydia's smile widened and she approached. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" Lydia said, her voice smooth as polished glass. "You're quite the fixture here, always so calm amidst the storm. May I join you?" "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm and inviting, as if welcoming a neighbour to tea. "It's kind of you to keep an old woman company." "Do sit." Lydia settled into the chair opposite, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, as if assessing Miss Marple's unassuming exterior. "This is all so dreadful," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of regret. "Poor Mr. Carver. Such a tragedy to mere Lady Ashford's lovely event." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her needles clicking softly. "It's shaken everyone, hasn't it?" "I suppose you knew Mr. Carver quite well, being such a prominent figure in the wine world yourself." Lydia's smile tightened, though it remained firmly in place. "Oh, we crossed paths often enough," she said airily. "Auctions are a small world, Miss Marple. One can't help but know one's competitors." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "Competitors, yes. It must be quite thrilling, vying for those rare bottles. In my village, we have a flower show every year, and the rivalry over the roses can be fierce. I imagine it's much the same with wine, only grander." Lydia laughed, a sound that rang a touch too bright. Grander, perhaps, but no less cutthroat. Carver was formidable. He had a knack for winning, no matter the cost, or to whom, Miss Marple murmured, her eyes meeting Lydia's briefly before returning to her knitting. "I've heard he could be quite ruthless." "Did he ever make things difficult for you?" Lydia's fingers brushed the emerald at her throat, a gesture so fleeting it might have gone unnoticed by a less observant eye. "Difficult?" she said, her tone light but edged. "He was a nuisance, I'll admit. Always driving up bids, bullying others into backing down. I lost a 47 Bordeaux to him last year, and he made sure everyone knew it. But that's the game, isn't it, Miss—" Marple's needles paused and she looked up, her gaze soft but penetrating. "A game, yes, but such a costly one. It must sting, losing to someone like that." I remember a young woman in St. Mary Mead, Miss Carter, who was so determined to win the baking contest that she stayed up all night perfecting her sponge cake. She didn't win, and oh, how it rankled. Lydia's lips twitched, as if suppressing a retort. "It does rankle," she admitted, her voice cooler now. "Carver didn't just win, he gloated. He'd send me notes afterward, crowing about his latest acquisition. But I'd never let a man like that get under my skin enough to do something foolish." "Foolish?" Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly, her tone as innocent as a child's. "Oh, surely not. You strike me as far too clever for that." "But it must have been tempting sometimes to put him in his place." Lydia's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Then she laughed again, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Tempting, perhaps, but I prefer to win my battles at the auction block, not with other methods." Miss Marple nodded, her smile unwavering, though her mind was racing. Lydia's composure was a carefully crafted armour, but there were chinks. Her tightened lips, the fleeting touch of her necklace, the way her laughter never quite reached her eyes. She thought of Mrs. Price in St. Mary Mead, whose ambition to outdo her rival had led to a petty act of sabotage, and wondered if Lydia's ambition had pushed her further. "Tell me, Mrs. Harcourt," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as ever. "You were near the wine table before the tasting, weren't you? I seem to recall seeing you there, adjusting your shawl. It was such a crowded moment, wasn't it?" Lydia's hand stilled on her necklace, and her smile faltered, just for an instant. "Was I?" she said, her tone airy. "I suppose I might have been." The room was a crush, people everywhere. I dropped my fan at one point and had to retrieve it. "But I wasn't near the glasses, if that's what you're implying." "Oh, I imply nothing, my dear," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling with disarming warmth. "I only mention it because you have such a keen eye for detail. I thought perhaps you'd noticed something, someone lingering near the table, perhaps, or anything out of place." Lydia leaned back, her composure restored, though her fingers remained curled around her necklace. "I'm afraid I was too busy bidding to notice much else," she said. "The Chateau Laveau was the prize of the evening, and I was determined to have it. Carver's theatrics didn't help, of course, but that's hardly surprising." Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Of course. Such a valuable bottle. It's no wonder everyone was so intent on it. And yet, only Mr. Carver's glass was poisoned." How precise the killer must have been. Lydia's eyes flicked to Miss Marple's, a flash of something, wariness perhaps, or calculation, passing through them. "Precise, yes," she said. "It's almost as if they knew exactly what they were doing." "But I wouldn't know, Miss Marple. I was across the room when it happened, as I told the inspector." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "And I'm sure the police will sort it all out. They're very thorough, aren't they? Always looking for those little clues that tell the story." Lydia rose, her movements graceful but abrupt. "They are," she said, her smile tight. "If you'll excuse me, I should see to Lady Ashford. She's been so kind, keeping us all here." Miss Marple watched her go, her eyes lingering on the sway of Lydia's dress, the confident tilt of her head. But confidence, she knew, could be a mask. In St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Elton had worn such a mask, charming the village while plotting to undermine her rivals. Lydia's ambition was grander, her stage larger, but the principle was the same. Her proximity to the wine table, her rivalry with Carver, and that fleeting moment of satisfaction when he fell, all pointed to a woman who might have seized an opportunity to remove an obstacle. As the drawing room emptied, Miss Marple remained by the fire, her knitting a steady counterpoint to her racing thoughts. She recalled Percival Thorne's mention of Lydia near the table, and Mr. Gray's furtive conversation with the footman. The web was growing more intricate, with each suspect adding a new strand. Lydia's ambition was a powerful motive, but was it enough to drive her to murder? And if so, how had she managed it in a crowded room with so many eyes watching? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Lady Ashford, who sank into the chair Lydia had vacated, her face drawn with exhaustion. "Jane, you're a saint for staying so composed," she said. "This is all so ghastly." "The police are testing the glass shards now, and they've questioned poor Percival again. He's a wreck. He does seem troubled," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "And Mrs. Harcourt. She's quite a force, isn't she?" So determined, Beatrice sighed. "Oh, yes. Lydia's been after Carver's crown for years. She's wealthy, but not as wealthy as he was, and it drove her mad to lose to him. I heard her say once she'd do anything to beat him." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. "Anything," she murmured. "What a curious choice of words." She thanked Beatrice and rose, her mind turning to the footman she'd seen with Mr. Gray. Servants, she knew, were often the key to unlocking a mystery, their eyes catching what others overlooked. As she made her way to the housekeeper's office, her steps slow and deliberate, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of the chase. The truth was there, hidden in the tangle of ambition, pride, and secrets, and she would find it, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 7. A Clue in the Glass. The evening shadows lengthened across Ashford Manor, their edges softening the grandeur of its halls, but sharpening the undercurrent of unease that permeated the estate. The guests, still confined by Inspector Crane's orders, had settled into a restless quiet, their conversations muted, as if the very act of speaking might summon further calamity. Miss Jane Marple, however, found the stillness invigorating, for it was in such moments that the smallest details, those overlooked by less patient eyes, came into focus. She sat in the library, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, the pale pink scarf a quiet testament to her steady presence amidst the storm. Her mind was occupied with the physical evidence of Reginald Carver's death, particularly the glass that had held the poisoned wine. Inspector Crane had shared a crucial detail that morning, during a brief conversation with Lady Ashford, that Miss Marple had overheard while adjusting her shawl near the drawing-room door. The poison, identified as strychnine, had been found only in the remnants of Carver's glass, not in the bottle of Chateau Lavaux. This narrowed the moment of the crime to the brief window between the pouring of the wine and Carver's fatal sip. A window crowded with opportunity, yet requiring a precision that intrigued her. Miss Marple had requested to see the auction room, now a silent witness to the tragedy, and Inspector Crane, though initially sceptical of the elderly spinster's involvement, had relented at Lady Ashford's insistence. "Miss Marple has a way of seeing things," Beatrice had said, and Crane, with a grudging nod, had allowed her access, provided she was accompanied by Sergeant Gibbs. Now, as she stood in the grand hall, the constable hovering awkwardly nearby. Miss Marple's sharp eyes surveyed the scene with the meticulous care of a gardener inspecting a prized rosebed. The room was much as it had been the previous evening, though the festive air had been replaced by a sterile chill. The dais where Percival Thorne had presided remained, its polished surface reflecting the dim light of the chandeliers. The table that had held the wine-glasses stood to one side, its cloth slightly askew, as if disturbed by the police's examination. The chalk outline of Carver's body was a stark intrusion on the polished floor, and nearby, a small area was cordoned off where the shattered glass had been collected. Miss Marple approached the table, her steps slow and deliberate, her black shawl a quiet contrast to the room's opulence. "Sergeant Gibbs," she said, her voice soft but clear, "might I ask what the police found on the glass shards? I understand there was something unusual." Gibbs, a young man with an earnest face and a tendency to fidget, glanced at her with a mix of respect and uncertainty. "Well, ma'am, I'm not supposed to share too much, but since the inspector allowed you here, they found strychnine as doctor. Hayward suspected, just in Mr. Carver's glass, mind you. The bottle was clean, and so were the other glasses." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes fixed on the table. "And was there anything else? A mark, perhaps, or something out of place?" Gibbs hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "There was a smudge on the glass, ma'am. Looked like a fingerprint at first, but it was blurred, like someone tried to wipe it off. The inspector thinks it might have been the killer." Covering their tracks, Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed. "A smudge," she murmured, her mind conjuring an image of the crowded hall, the glasses gleaming under the chandeliers, and a swift, daring hand slipping poison into one. "How very interesting! And was there anything else near the table? A cloth, perhaps, or a napkin?" Gibbs's eyes widened slightly, as if surprised by her question. "Funny you mention that, ma'am. There was a napkin, crumpled up under the table. Had a bit of wine on it, and the lab's testing it now. The inspector thinks it might have been used to wipe the glass." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. "How thorough the police are," she said. "It reminds me of a time in my village when a young boy, Tommy Lane, tried to steal apples from Mr. Griggs's orchard. He wiped his hands on his shirt to hide the juice, but the stains gave him away. Small things, Sergeant, can tell such big stories." Gibbs nodded, clearly unsure how to respond to her village anecdotes, but sensing her quiet authority. "I suppose so, ma'am. The inspector's hoping the napkin might give us a lead." Miss Marple moved closer to the table, her gaze sweeping over its surface. The glasses had been removed for testing, but she could picture them as they had been. A neat row of crystal, each filled with a measure of ruby-red wine, their stems catching the light. She recalled the chaos of the auction, guests milling about, footmen circulating, bidders vying for position. It would have taken only a moment to tamper with Carver's glass, but it required nerve and opportunity. She thought of Lydia Harcourt, bending to retrieve her fan near the table, as Thorne had mentioned, and Mr. Grey, always hovering at the edges, his eyes on Carver. Even Madame Dubois, so protective of her wine, had been near the dais before the tasting. Thorne himself, though visible on the dais, could have acted earlier when the glasses were set out. She turned to Gibbs, her voice gentle but probing. "Tell me, Sergeant, Were the glasses already on the table when the wine was brought up from the cellar? Gibbs scratched his head, thinking, "Yes, ma'am, I believe so." The footman set them out before the auction started. Mr. Thorne was overseeing things, and Madame Dubois brought the bottles up just before the tasting. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. The glasses, then, had been vulnerable for some time, accessible to anyone who passed by. She thought of Mrs. Carter in St. Mary Mead, who had once slipped a laxative into a rival's tea during a church fete, her movements so swift that no one noticed until the effects were undeniable. The principle here was the same. A quick hand, a distracted crowd, and a moment of boldness. She moved to the cordoned-off area where the glass had shattered, crouching slightly to examine the floor. Gibbs hovered, as if worried she might faint, but Miss Marple's movements were steady, her eyes sharp. She noticed a faint scuff mark near the chalk outline, as if someone had stepped hastily away from the spot where Carver fell. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple had learned never to dismiss the small things. In St. Mary Mead, a scuff mark on a garden path had once led her to a thief who'd thought himself clever. As she straightened, she caught sight of a footman passing the hall's entrance, his face pale and his eyes darting nervously. It was the same young man she'd seen with Mr. Gray, the one who had taken something from him in the corridor. She made a mental note to speak with him, perhaps through the housekeeper, who was always a fount of information about the staff. "Sergeant Gibbs," she said, turning to him with a disarming smile, "you've been most helpful. I won't keep you from your duties. I'm sure the inspector will want to know about that napkin as soon as possible." Gibbs nodded, tipping his cap. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll let him know you were here." As he left, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, her gaze sweeping the room. The smudge on the glass, the stained napkin, the scuff mark on the floor. They were pieces of a puzzle, each small but significant. She thought of the suspects: Thorne, with his debts and fear; Madame Dubois, with her wounded pride; Gray, with his secretive air; and Lydia Harcourt, with her burning ambition. Each had a motive, each had opportunity, but the clue in the glass pointed to someone who had acted with care, yet not quite carefully enough. She returned to the library, settling into her alcove and resuming her knitting. The click of her needles was a steady rhythm, a counterpoint to the whirl of her thoughts. The napkin, she suspected, would be the key. If it held traces of strychnine, it would confirm that the killer had wiped the glass to obscure their fingerprints, a calculated move that suggested premeditation. But who among the suspects had the nerve to act so boldly in a crowded room? Lydia Harcourt, with her sharp eyes and sharper ambition, seemed the most likely. Yet Miss Marple was not ready to dismiss the others. Gray's secrecy nagged at her, as did Thorne's desperation and Madame Dubois' fierce pride. As she knitted, she overheard a snippet of conversation from two guests passing the library door. "The police are questioning the staff now," one said. "They think someone might have seen something." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. The staff, she knew, were often the eyes and ears of a house, unnoticed but all-seeing. She resolved to speak with the housekeeper soon, to learn more about the footman and his connection to Gray. For now, she let her mind wander over the clues, each one a thread in the web she was weaving. The truth was there, hidden in the smudged, the napkin, the scuff mark. In St. Mary Mead, she had unravelled mysteries with less, A dropped letter, a whispered rumour, a glance that betrayed a secret. Here, in the grandeur of Ashford Manor, the stakes were higher, but the human heart was the same, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and sharp insight, would find the heart that had turned to murder. Chapter 8. The Manor's Shadows. The evening at Ashford Manor settled into a hushed unease, as if the very walls absorbed the weight of suspicion that hung over its inhabitants. The grand chandeliers, dimmed to conserve the sombre mood, cast long, flickering shadows across the corridors, where guests moved like spectres, their footsteps muffled on the thick carpets. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the gloom, navigated the manor with her characteristic quiet purpose, her black shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her small bag clutched in one hand. The clues she had gathered, the smudged glass, the stained napkin, the scuff mark near Carver's body, formed a delicate web in her mind, each thread leading to a suspect, each suspect hiding a shadow of their own. Her thoughts now turned to the manor's staff, those unseen observers who often held the key to a mystery. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had unravelled many a puzzle by listening to the maids and gardeners, whose eyes caught what the gentry overlooked. The footman she had seen with Mr. Grey, his nervous demeanour, and the secretive exchange in the corridor lingered in her memory like a misplaced stitch in her knitting. She needed to know more about him, and about the manor's inner workings, to understand how the poison had found its way into Carver's glass. Miss Marple sought out Lady Ashford, whom she found in the morning room, a cosy space adorned with chintz curtains and a low table set with a silver tea-tray. Beatrice was pale, her usual vivacity dulled by the strain of hosting a house under siege. She was speaking with Mrs. Benton, the housekeeper, a stout woman with a brisk manner, and eyes that missed little. As Miss Marple entered, Beatrice looked up with a weary smile. "Jane, you're a godsend," she said, gesturing to a chair. "I don't know how you stay so composed. The police are turning the place upside down, and the guests are at each other's throats." "It's a trying time," Miss Marple replied, settling into the chair with a gentle nod to Mrs. Benton. "But I find a cup of tea and a bit of quiet thought can work wonders. I was hoping, Beatrice, to have a word about the staff. They see so much, don't they, without ever being noticed?" Mrs. Benton's lips twitched, as if recognizing a kindred spirit in observation. "They do, Miss Marple," she said. "My lot are trained to keep their eyes open and their mouths shut, but they notice everything." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "How very like my village, Mrs. Benton. Our housemaids always know more than they let on. I was wondering about the young footman, Tommy, I believe. I saw him in the corridor yesterday, looking rather distressed." Beatrice frowned, glancing at Mrs. Benton. "Tommy Wells? He's been a bit off since the auction, hasn't he? I noticed him avoiding the police this morning." Mrs. Benton nodded, her expression tightening. "He's a good lad usually, but he's been jumpy. And he didn't turn up for his duties this afternoon. I sent one of the maids to look for him, but she said he was nowhere in the servants' quarters." Miss Marple's needles, though still in her bag, seemed to click in her mind. "How curious," she said softly. "I couldn't help but notice him speaking with Mr. Grey yesterday. They seemed quite intent. Do you know if they were acquainted?" Mrs. Benton's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Grey? That odd fellow with the hat? I don't think so, but Tommy's only been with us a few weeks. He was a last-minute hire, recommended by a friend of Lady Ashford's cousin in London. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now—" Beatrice leaned forward, her voice low. "Jane, you don't think Tommy's involved, do you? He's so young, barely 20. Surely he wouldn't—" "Oh, I think nothing, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing but her eyes sharp. "I only wonder what a young man like that might have seen or been asked to do. In St. Mary Mead, we had a lad, young Billy, who got himself mixed up with a poacher because he was promised a few shillings. He didn't mean harm, but he saw things he shouldn't have." Mrs. Benton's face hardened. "If Tommy's mixed up in something, I'll have his hide." "But I'll find him, Miss Marple. I'll have a word with the maids and see what they know." "Thank you, Mrs. Benton," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "It's such a comfort to know the house is in such capable hands." As the housekeeper left, Miss Marple turned to Beatrice, her voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "Tell me, Beatrice, about Mr. Gray's invitation. He's not a regular at these auctions, I gather. How did he come to be here?" Beatrice sighed, rubbing her temples. "It was rather last minute. My cousin, Lord Harwood, vouched for him. Said he was a wine enthusiast, a friend of a friend in London. I didn't press for details. Harwood's usually reliable, but Gray's been so elusive. I barely saw him before the auction, and now he keeps to himself." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the information. Lord Harwood's connection to Gray was another thread, one that might link to the cigarette case with its mysterious crest. She thought of the Greystone family scandal, a faint memory from a decade-old newspaper, and resolved to ask Beatrice for access to the Manor's guest records later. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple caught sight of Lydia Harcourt passing the morning-room door, her navy dress a stark contrast to the pale walls. Lydia's head was bent in conversation with another guest, her voice low but animated. Miss Marple recalled Thorne's mention of Lydia near the wine table, and the fleeting satisfaction in her eyes when Carver fell. But now another detail surfaced: the footman, Tommy Wells, and his connection to Gray. Could Lydia have been involved with Gray, perhaps orchestrating something through the young servant? She made her way to the library, her usual sanctuary, and settled into her alcove. The room was quieter now, the guests avoiding its sombre shelves as if the books themselves held secrets. Miss Marple's knitting resumed, the click of her needles a steady rhythm as she sifted through the day's revelations. The footman's absence was troubling, suggesting either guilt or fear. Gray's involvement with him hinted at a deeper game, one that might intersect with Lydia's ambition or Thorne's desperation. Madame Dubois, too, remained in her thoughts, her pride a potential spark for violence, though Miss Marple still doubted she would taint her own wine. As she knitted, she overheard a snippet of conversation from two maids passing the library door. "Tommy's not in his room," one whispered. "I heard he was seen near the stables, looking like he was about to bolt." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A runaway servant was a classic sign of trouble, like young Jenny in St. Mary Mead, who had fled after witnessing a theft she dared not report. She resolved to speak with Inspector Crane to ensure the police were aware of Tommy's absence. As she rose, her gaze fell on a newspaper left on a nearby table, its headline about a recent London scandal catching her eye. She scanned it briefly, noting a mention of a disgraced financier named Victor Greystone, whose family crest matched the one on Gray's cigarette case. The coincidence was too striking to ignore, and Miss Marple felt a quiet thrill, the kind she always felt when a pattern began to emerge. She made her way to the hall, where Crane was conferring with Sergeant Gibbs. Approaching with her usual deference, she mentioned Tommy Wells's absence, her tone casual but pointed. "I do hope the young man is found, Inspector," she said. "Servants see so much, don't they? He might know something important." Crane's granite face softened slightly, though his eyes remained wary. "We're looking for him, Miss Marple. Thank you for the tip. Anything else you've noticed?" "Oh, nothing specific," she said, her smile disarming. "Just an old woman's fancies. But I did wonder about that napkin you found. Any news from the laboratory?" Crane hesitated, then relented. "Early results show traces of strychnine on it, along with the wine. Someone used it to wipe the glass, we think. We're still checking for prints." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The napkin was a crucial link, tying the smudged glass to the killer's hand. As she thanked Crane and returned to the library, she felt the web tightening. The shadows of the manor, Thorne's fear, Madame Dubois' pride, Gray's secrecy, Lydia's ambition, and now Tommy's flight were converging, and Miss Marple knew that the truth, like a hidden stitch, was waiting to be pulled free. Chapter 9. A Conversation Over Tea. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Ashford Manor's morning room, casting a soft, dappled glow across the chintz-covered furniture and the gleaming silver tea service. The air was fragrant with the scent of freshly brewed Darjeeling, a small comfort amidst the lingering tension that gripped the estate. Miss Jane Marple sat at a small round table, her black shawl neatly draped over her shoulders, her knitting bag resting beside her. The pale pink scarf, now nearly complete, lay folded in her lap, a testament to her steady patience in the face of chaos. She had invited Mrs. Lydia Harcourt for tea, knowing that such a setting, intimate, unthreatening, often loosened tongues that were otherwise tightly guarded. Miss Marple's choice of Lydia was deliberate. The rival bidder's ambition, her proximity to the wine table, and the fleeting satisfaction Miss Marple had glimpsed in her eyes when Carver collapsed, had woven a thread of suspicion that demanded closer inspection. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had often found that a quiet chat over tea revealed more than a formal interrogation, as people let their guard down when they felt in control. Lydia, with her sharp wit and sharper ambition, would be no exception, or so Miss Marple hoped. Lydia entered the morning room with her usual grace, her navy dress replaced by a tailored cream ensemble that exuded confidence. Her emerald necklace, a constant presence, caught the light as she moved, and her smile was as polished as ever, though Miss Marple noted a slight tension in its corners. "Miss Marple," Lydia said, her voice bright but measured, "how kind of you to invite me. I confess, I could use a moment's respite from all this unpleasantness." "Do sit, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm and inviting, as if welcoming a dear friend. "A cup of tea does wonders, doesn't it?" "I find it soothes the nerves, especially in such trying times." Lydia settled into the chair opposite, her posture relaxed but her eyes alert, as if sensing the undercurrent of Miss Marple's gentle inquiry. The maid, who had been hovering near the door, poured tea and withdrew, leaving the two women alone. Miss Marple lifted the teapot with a steady hand, pouring for both of them, her movements deliberate and unhurried, You must be quite shaken, Mrs. Harcourt, she began, passing a cup across the table. Such a dreadful thing, Mr. Carver's death, and right in the midst of the auction. I imagine it's put quite a damper on your plans. Lydia took the cup, her fingers brushing the saucer lightly. It has, she admitted, her voice carrying a hint of regret that seemed carefully calibrated. The Chateau Laveau was the prize of the evening, and I was determined to have it. Carver's death, tragic as it is, has rather overshadowed the event. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes crinkling with sympathy. Of course, it must be frustrating after all your efforts. In my village, we have a flower show, and I remember how upset Mrs. Bantry was when a storm ruined the roses just before judging. All that work, gone to waste. You and Mr. Carver were such fierce rivals, weren't you? Lydia's smile tightened, and she sipped her tea, her eyes flicking to Miss Marple's over the rim of the cup. Rivals, yes, she said. Carver was a formidable opponent. He had a way of making every auction a battle, and he didn't play fair. But that's the wine world, Miss Marple. It's not for the faint of heart. Oh, I can imagine, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but probing. He sounds like quite a character. I've heard stories of his temper, his relentlessness. Did he ever make things personal with you? Lydia's hand paused, the cup halfway to her lips, and for a moment her composure wavered. Personal, she said, her tone light but edged. He made it personal with everyone. He'd send taunting letters after auctions, gloating about his wins. I received one after he snatched that 47 Bordeaux from me last year. He called it a pity I couldn't keep up. The man was insufferable. Miss Marple's needles, though still in her bag, seemed to click in her mind as she noted the bitterness in Lydia's voice. How unkind, she said. It reminds me of Mr. Griggs in St. Mary Mead, who used to boast about his roses until it drove poor Mrs. Price to distraction. It must have been terribly galling, losing to someone like that. Lydia's lips twitched, as if suppressing a retort. Galling, yes, she said, setting her cup down with a delicate clink. But I learned to play the game better. I wasn't going to let Carver win forever. The Chateau Laveau was my chance to prove it. Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze gentle but unyielding. And such a chance it was, she said. You were bidding so fiercely, weren't you? I seem to recall you were near the wine table earlier, adjusting your shawl. It was such a crowded moment. People everywhere, glasses gleaming. Did you happen to notice anything unusual? Lydia's hand moved to her necklace, her fingers brushing the emerald as if for reassurance. Unusual, she said, her voice steady but her eyes narrowing slightly. I was focused on the auction, Miss Marple. I dropped my fan near the table as I told the inspector, but I didn't touch the glasses. I was too busy trying to outbid Carver. Of course, Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. It was such a hectic evening. I only ask because you have such a sharp eye. In my village, Mrs. Carter always noticed the smallest things at our fêtes. Who was where, what they were doing. I thought perhaps you might have seen someone near the glasses, or something out of place. Lydia leaned back, her composure restored, though her fingers lingered on her necklace. I'm afraid I didn't, she said. The room was a whirlwind. I was watching Carver, not the table. He was making such a show of himself. As usual, Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild disappointment, though her mind was racing. Lydia's denial was smooth, but the touch of her necklace, the slight pause before her answers, betrayed a nervousness that belied her confidence. She thought of Mrs. Elton in St. Mary Mead, whose polished exterior had cracked under gentle pressure, revealing a petty theft she'd thought well hidden. As they sipped their tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the auction setup, her tone casual but deliberate. "It's so fascinating how these events are arranged," she said. "All those glasses on the table, waiting for the tasting. I suppose they were set out well before the wine was poured." Lydia's eyes flicked to hers, a flicker of wariness passing through them. "I suppose so," she said. "The footman handled all that. I didn't pay much attention. My focus was on the bidding." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "But it's such a delicate process, isn't it? One wrong move and everything could go awry. Like that napkin the police found. Such a small thing, but so important." Lydia's hand froze, her cup halfway to her lips, and her face paled, just for an instant. "Napkin," she said, her tone light but strained. "I don't know anything about a napkin." "Oh, just something the police mentioned," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling faintly. "A crumpled napkin under the table, stained with wine. They think it might have been used to wipe the glass. How curious, don't you think?" Lydia set her cup down, her movements deliberate. "Very curious," she said, her voice tight, "but I'm sure the police will figure it out. They're so thorough, aren't they?" "Indeed they are," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "They always find the truth, sooner or later." Lydia rose abruptly, smoothing her dress with a quick, nervous gesture. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I should check on Lady Ashford. She's been so kind keeping us all here." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone as warm as ever. "Thank you for indulging an old woman's chatter." As Lydia left, her steps brisk and her head held high, Miss Marple watched her go, her mind cataloguing the moment. Lydia's reaction to the napkin, her sudden pallor, her abrupt departure, was a crack in her polished facade, like the moment Mrs. Elton had flinched when questioned about a missing brooch. Ambition, Miss Marple knew, could drive a woman to desperate acts, and Lydia's rivalry with Carver had been a fire that burned fiercely. But had it burned hot enough for murder? Miss Marple remained at the table, sipping her tea, her thoughts turning to the other suspects. Percival Thorne's debts, Madame Dubois' pride, and Mr. Grey's secrecy each held their own shadows, but Lydia's ambition seemed the brightest thread, the one most likely to have led to the poisoned glass. Yet the footman, Tommy Wells, and his connection to Grey nagged at her. She needed to know more about him, and about the mysterious exchange she had witnessed. As she rose to return to the library, she caught sight of Inspector Crane in the corridor, speaking with a constable. She paused, pretending to adjust her shawl, and overheard a snippet of their conversation. "The napkin's got strychnine on it, sir." "No prints, but it's a match." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. The napkin was the key, she was certain, and Lydia's reaction had confirmed its importance. She resolved to speak with Mrs. Benton, the housekeeper, about Tommy Wells. The young footman's absence and his connection to Grey was another thread in the web, one that might unravel the truth. As she made her way to the library, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of the chase. The truth was there, hidden in the shadows of ambition and secrecy, and she would find it, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 10. The Footman's Tale. The twilight at Ashford Manor deepened, casting a sombre veil over the estate's sprawling grounds. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of damp earth and fading roses, a reminder of the autumn's approach. Inside, the manor's corridors were quiet, the guests subdued by the weight of suspicion and the relentless presence of Inspector Crane's men. Miss Jane Marple, ever attuned to the subtle currents of human behaviour, moved through the house with her quiet determination. Her black shawl, a familiar cloak against the chill of both the evening and the mystery at hand. Her knitting bag, containing the nearly completed pink scarf, hung at her side, a silent companion to her thoughts. Her focus now was on Tommy Wells, the young footman whose nervous demeanour and sudden absence had caught her attention. The fleeting glimpse of his exchange with Mr. Victor Gray in the corridor, coupled with the maid's whispers of his disappearance, suggested he held a piece of the puzzle surrounding Reginald Carver's death. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had often found that the humblest figures, maids, gardeners, delivery boys, saw things others overlooked, their unnoticed presence making them privy to secrets. Tommy, she suspected, was no exception, and his flight hinted at either fear or guilt. Miss Marple had enlisted the help of Mrs. Benton, the housekeeper, whose brisk efficiency and sharp eyes made her an invaluable ally. After a discreet conversation in the servants' hall, Mrs. Benton had confirmed that Tommy had been spotted near the stables, looking as though he meant to leave the estate. Inspector Crane, alerted by Miss Marple's gentle suggestion, had sent constables to search for him, and by late afternoon, Tommy had been found hiding in a hayloft, his face pale and his hands trembling. Now he sat in a small parlour off the main hall, a modest room used for staff meetings, with Inspector Crane, Sergeant Gibbs, and Miss Marple present at Crane's reluctant allowance. Lady Ashford had vouched for her friend's insight, and Crane, though sceptical, had agreed to let her observe, provided she remained silent. Tommy Wells was a lanky young man of about 20, with sandy hair and wide, frightened eyes that darted between Crane and the floor. His livery was rumpled, a far cry from the polished appearance of the auction night, and his fingers twisted a cloth cap in his lap. Miss Marple sat in a corner, her knitting in hand, her needles moving slowly as she watched the boy with her bird-like gaze. She noted his pallor, his quick breaths, and the way his shoulders hunched, as if bracing for a blow. He reminded her of young Billy in St. Mary Mead, who had once confessed to stealing apples after a similar bout of nerves. "Tommy Wells," Inspector Crane began, his voice firm but not unkind. "You've caused quite a stir, running off like that. Care to explain why you thought hiding in a hayloft was a good idea?" Tommy swallowed hard, his eyes flickering to Miss Marple before dropping back to his cap. "I didn't mean no harm, sir," he said, his voice shaky. I got scared. After what happened to Mr. Carver and the police asking questions, I thought maybe I'd be blamed." "Blamed?" Crane leaned forward, his granite face unyielding. "For what exactly? Were you involved in Mr. Carver's death?" "No, sir!" Tommy's head shot up, his eyes wide with panic. "I swear, I didn't do nothing to him. I was just serving, like I was told. I didn't touch the wine or the glasses." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze softening as she studied the boy. His fear was genuine, she thought, but it was the fear of someone caught in a web not entirely of their own making. She recalled Mrs. Carter's nephew in St. Mary Mead, who had been coerced into a petty theft by an older man's promises. Tommy's connection to Gray suggested a similar dynamic, and she leaned forward slightly, her presence unobtrusive but attentive. Crane's eyes narrowed. "Then why run, lad? Innocent people don't hide in haylofts. What were you afraid of?" Tommy's fingers tightened around his cap, twisting it until the fabric strained. It's Mr. Gray, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He paid me to leave the manor after the auction. Said it'd be best if I wasn't around when the police started poking about." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A gesture so subtle, it went unnoticed by Crane and Gibbs. Gray's involvement was no surprise, but the confirmation of his influence over Tommy was a new thread in the web. She thought of the cigarette case, the crest that hinted at a hidden past, and now this bribe, a clear attempt to remove a witness. Crane's expression hardened. "Paid you? How much, and for what?" Tommy hesitated, his eyes darting to the door as if hoping for escape. £10, sir," he said finally. "He gave it to me in the corridor, the night of the auction. Said I should take a few days off, go visit my mum in the village. I didn't think much of it at first, but after Mr. Carver died, I got scared. Thought maybe he wanted me gone because I saw something I shouldn't." Crane leaned back, his notebook open, his pencil poised. "And what did you see, Tommy? No lies now. The truth, or you'll be in more trouble than you can imagine." Tommy's face crumpled, and he rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand. I saw Mr. Gray talking to Mrs. Harcourt, sir. Before the auction started, near the wine table, they were whispering, and I saw her pass him something, a small vial, like the kind you'd keep perfume in. He put it in his pocket quick, and they didn't see me watching. I was just clearing glasses, but I heard Mrs. Harcourt say, 'Make sure it's done right.' I didn't think nothing of it then, but now." Miss Marple's needles stilled entirely, her hands resting in her lap as she absorbed the boy's words. A vial passed from Lydia to Gray, and a whispered instruction. It was a damning revelation, one that tied Lydia's ambition to Gray's secrecy in a way that sent a shiver through her. She thought of Mrs. Price in St. Mary Mead, who had once conspired with a neighbour to sabotage a rival's garden, their whispers overheard by a passing milkman. The principle here was the same, but the stakes were far higher. Crane's eyes gleamed with interest, though his voice remained steady. "A vial, you say? And you're sure it was Mrs. Harcourt and Mr. Gray?" Tommy nodded vigorously, his cap now a mangled wreck in his hands. "Yes, sir, I know it was them. Mrs. Harcourt in her green dress, and Mr. Gray with that hat he always wears. I didn't hear nothing else, I swear. I just took the money and thought I'd do as he said. But when I heard about the poison, I got scared and hid." Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the threads. Lydia's ambition, her proximity to the wine table, her reaction to the mention of the napkin, all pointed to her involvement. But Gray's role was less clear. Was he her accomplice, hired to carry out the act, or did he have his own motives that the vial suggested premeditation, a plan hatched before the auction began? And the napkin, with its traces of strychnine, could have been used by either of them to wipe the glass, obscuring their fingerprints. Crane pressed Tommy further, his questions sharp but measured. "Did you see either of them near the glasses during the tasting, or anyone else acting strangely?" Tommy shook his head, his eyes downcast. "No, sir. I was busy with the trays, moving through the crowd. The table was crowded, people coming and going. I didn't see nothing specific." Crane nodded, jotting a note in his book. "All right, Tommy. You're not off the hook yet, but you've helped yourself by talking. Stay in the manor, and don't think about running again. We'll find you." Tommy nodded, his shoulders slumping with relief and exhaustion. As Gibbs escorted him out, Miss Marple remained in her corner, her knitting untouched, her mind buzzing with the new information. She thought of the smudged glass, the stained napkin, and now the vial. A chain of evidence that pointed to Lydia and Gray. But the why and how remained elusive. Lydia's ambition to outshine Carver was a powerful motive, but Gray's involvement suggested a deeper plot, perhaps tied to his mysterious past. As Crane turned to leave, he caught Miss Marple's eye, his expression a mix of irritation and grudging respect. "You've got a knack for being in the right place, Miss Marple," he said. "Anything to add?" "Oh, nothing specific, Inspector," she said, her smile disarming. "Just an old woman's curiosity." "But that vial, it's rather significant, isn't it? Such a small thing, but so telling." Crane's lips twitched, as if suppressing a smile. "We'll look into it. Gray and Mrs. Harcourt will have some questions to answer." As he left, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and rose, her steps slow but purposeful. She needed to speak with Lady Ashford about Gray's invitation, to confirm his connection to Lord Harwood and the possible link to the Greystone family. And Lydia? She would need watching, for her reaction to the napkin had been telling, and now Tommy's tale had tightened the noose. As she made her way to the library, her sanctuary of quiet thought, Miss Marple felt the web closing in, the shadows of the manor, Thorne's debts, Madame Dubois' pride, Gray's secrecy, Lydia's ambition, and now Tommy's fear, were converging, and the truth was within reach. In St. Mary Mead, she had unravelled mysteries with less, a whispered rumour, a misplaced glove, a glance that betrayed a secret. Here, the stakes were higher, but the human heart was the same, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, would find the heart that had turned to murder. Chapter 11. The Final Piece. The morning at Ashford Manor broke with a brittle clarity, the mist of previous days giving way to a sharp, cold sunlight that pierced the tall windows and illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. The grandeur of the estate seemed diminished, its opulence overshadowed by the persistent shadow of Reginald Carver's death. The guests, though still confined by Inspector Crane's orders, had settled into a strained routine, their conversations reduced to murmurs of speculation and unease. Miss Jane Marple, however, moved through the manor with her characteristic quiet resolve, her black shawl a familiar sight, her knitting bag a constant companion. The pale pink scarf, now nearly finished, lay folded in her lap as she sat in the library, her mind weaving together the threads of the mystery that had consumed her thoughts. Tommy Wells's revelation about the vial, passed from Mrs. Lydia Harcourt to Mr. Victor Gray, had shifted the pattern of the case, tightening the web around the two suspects. The smudged glass, the strychnine-stained napkin, and now the whispered exchange near the wine table, formed a chain of evidence that Miss Marple could no longer ignore. Yet the motives and mechanics of the crime remained tantalizingly out of reach, like a dropped stitch she could sense but not yet retrieve. She needed to confirm the connections, to test the strength of each thread, and to do so, she sought a private audience with Inspector Crane. She found him in the manor's study, a wood-panelled room lined with books and maps, where he was reviewing notes with Sergeant Gibbs. The inspector looked up as she entered, his granite face softening slightly at the sight of her unassuming figure. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mix of respect and exasperation. "You've a habit of turning up at the right moment. Lady Ashford swears by your insight, so I suppose I'm obliged to listen." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with disarming warmth. "You're too kind, Inspector. I'm only an old woman with a knack for noticing things, but I thought you might find it useful to hear a few observations, if you'll indulge me." Crane gestured to a chair, and Miss Marple settled into it, her knitting bag resting at her feet. Gibbs stood by the door, his notebook ready. As Crane leaned forward, "Go on then," he said. "What's on your mind?" Miss Marple's voice was soft but clear, her words measured like the stitches in her scarf. "It's about the glass, Inspector, the one that held the poison. The smudge you found, like a fingerprint but blurred, suggests someone wiped it in haste, doesn't it? And the napkin, with its traces of strychnine, confirms it was used to clean the glass, perhaps to obscure a mark that could identify the culprit." Crane nodded, his eyes narrowing. "That's right. The lab confirmed the strychnine on the napkin this morning. No fingerprints, though, which is frustrating. Whoever did, it was careful, but not careful enough. Indeed," Miss Marple said, her gaze steady. "And then there's young Tommy Wells, the footman." He saw Mrs. Harcourt pass a vial to Mr. Grey before the auction, near the wine table, with words that suggested a plan. "Make sure it's done right," she said. "It's rather suggestive, don't you think?" Crane's jaw tightened, and he exchanged a glance with Gibbs. "It is. We've got Grey in for questioning again, but he's slippery. Claims he was just talking business with Mrs. Harcourt, nothing more. No vial, no proof, he says." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "How like people to deny what's plain to see." "In my village, St. Mary Mead, we had a young man, Mr. Harrow, who swore he'd never touched a stolen bicycle, but the mud on his shoes told a different story. I wonder, Inspector, have you looked into Mr. Grey's background? His cigarette case, with that crest, a lion and a star. Reminds me of a family I read about years ago, the Greystones, who fell into scandal." Crane's eyebrows rose, and he made a note. "Greystones, you say? We'll check it. His invitation came through Lord Harwood, but we haven't dug deeper yet. As for Mrs. Harcourt, she's been cool as ice, denying everything. Says she was nowhere near the glasses when the poison was slipped in." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed. "Cool? Yes, but I noticed her falter when I mentioned the napkin during our tea yesterday. She left rather abruptly, as if I'd touched a nerve. And Mr. Thorne, the auctioneer, mentioned seeing her near the wine table, bending to pick up her fan. It's a small thing, but small things can be so telling." Crane leaned back, his expression grudgingly impressed. "You've been busy, Miss Marple. We've got witnesses placing her near the table, but no one saw her touch the glasses. The timing's tight. Thorne poured the wine. The glasses were on the table for maybe 10 minutes before the tasting. Someone acted fast." Miss Marple nodded, her mind sifting through the scene. 10 minutes, she murmured. A crowded room, people milling about, glasses gleaming under the chandeliers. It would take nerve, but not much time to slip something into one glass. And the napkin, discarded under the table, suggests they didn't have a chance to dispose of it properly. Mrs. Harcourt's ambition, Inspector. She wanted that Chateau Laveau, and Carver was her greatest obstacle. Crane's eyes gleamed with interest. You think she did it to win the auction? Not just the auction, Miss Marple said softly. In Saint Mary Mead, we had a woman, Mrs. Elton, who went to great lengths to outshine her rival at the flower show. It wasn't just about roses. It was about pride, about proving she was better. Mrs. Harcourt's rivalry with Carver was personal. He humiliated her, sent her, taunting letters, stole bottles she coveted. That kind of resentment can fester. Crane made another note, his pencil scratching across the page. And Gray? What's his role in your theory? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. I'm not sure yet, Inspector. But his secrecy, his payment to Tommy Wells to leave, and that vial suggest he's more than a bystander. Perhaps Mrs. Harcourt enlisted him, a hired hand, or someone with his own grudge against Carver. The crest on his cigarette case might tell us more. If he's connected to the Greystones, there could be a history we don't yet know. Crane nodded, his expression thoughtful. We'll bring them both in again. If that vial exists, we'll find it. And we're still looking for prints on the napkin, though it's a long shot. Miss Marple smiled, her hands folding neatly in her lap. You're very thorough, Inspector. I'm sure you'll find the truth. It's always there, waiting to be seen like a pattern in a piece of lace. As Crane and Gibbs left to prepare for the interrogations, Miss Marple remained in the study, her mind turning over the clues. The smudged glass, the stained napkin, Tommy's tale of the vial, all pointed to Lydia Harcourt, with Gray as her accomplice. But the why and how needed clarity. She recalled Lydia's reaction to the napkin, her sudden pallor, and Gray's evasive answers in the garden. The pieces were falling into place, but one final thread was needed to complete the pattern. Later that day, Crane confronted Lydia Harcourt in the drawing-room, with Miss Marple present at Lady Ashford's insistence. Lydia stood by the fireplace, her cream dress immaculate, her emerald necklace glinting like a challenge. Crane laid out the evidence, Tommy's testimony, the napkin with strychnine, her proximity to the wine table. Lydia's face remained composed, but her hands clenched at her sides. I've told you, Inspector, she said, her voice icy. I was bidding, not poisoning. Tommy's a frightened boy who'll say anything to save himself, and that napkin could belong to anyone. But under Crane's relentless questioning, her composure cracked. She admitted to passing a vial to Gray, not poison, she claimed, but a sedative, meant to make Carver drowsy and throw him off his game. It was a prank, she insisted, her voice trembling. I never meant for him to die. Crane pressed harder, and Lydia's story unravelled. She confessed to slipping strychnine into Carver's glass, driven by years of humiliation at his hands. Gray, she said, had supplied the poison, believing he was aiding a minor scheme. His own motives remained unclear, but his connection to the Greystone family, confirmed by Crane's inquiries, suggested a personal vendetta against Carver, who had once ruined a Greystone business deal. Gray, brought in separately, denied everything at first, but the discovery of the vial in his room, hidden in a false bottom of his cigarette case, sealed his fate. Both were arrested, Lydia's ambition and Gray's secrecy their undoing. Miss Marple watched from her corner, her knitting still, her heart heavy but satisfied. The truth had emerged, as it always did, from the shadows of human folly. As she gathered her bag and prepared to return to the library, she felt the familiar quiet thrill of a mystery solved, though the cost as ever, was a reminder of the fragility of the human heart. Chapter 12. The Quiet Aftermath. The sun rose over Ashford Manor with a tentative warmth, its rays filtering through the tall windows to chase away the lingering shadows of the past days. The estate, so recently a stage for tragedy, seemed to exhale, its grandeur restored as the weight of suspicion lifted. The guests, released from Inspector Crane's confinement, prepared to depart, their voices a soft murmur of relief and farewells. The auction room, once a scene of chaos, was being quietly restored. The chalk outline of Reginald Carver's body erased, the broken glass swept away. Yet the memory of the event clung to the air, a faint echo of the human frailties that had unravelled there. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, a cosy haven of chintz and sunlight, sharing a final cup of tea with Lady Beatrice Ashford. Her black shawl was draped over the back of her chair, and her knitting bag rested at her feet, the pale pink scarf now complete, neatly folded like a chapter closed. The room was fragrant with the scent of Darjeeling and the faint perfume of roses from a vase on the table, a reminder of the world beyond the manor's turmoil. Miss Marple's bird-like eyes were bright, her expression serene, but her mind was still turning over the threads of the mystery she had helped unravel. Beatrice, though weary from the ordeal, had regained some of her usual warmth. She leaned forward, her hands clasped around her teacup, her eyes fixed on Miss Marple with a mixture of gratitude and awe. "Jane, I don't know how you do it," she said, her voice soft but earnest. "You saw through it all. Lydia, Gray, the vial, the napkin. The police would have got there eventually, I'm sure, but you made it so much clearer. How do you see these things?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking faintly in her memory, though her hands were still. "Oh, my dear, it's nothing so remarkable," she said, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. "People are much like villages, you know. They have their secrets, their little dramas, and if you watch closely, they tell you everything. In St. Mary Mead, I've seen it all before. Ambition, pride, fear. It's the same here, only dressed in finer clothes." Beatrice shook her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You make it sound so simple, but it's not. Lydia Harcourt, I never would have thought her capable of such a thing, and Mr. Gray, with his false name and that dreadful past. You tied it all together, Miss Marple," sipped her tea, her gaze drifting to the window where the garden stretched toward the horizon. "Lydia's ambition was her undoing," she said softly. "She wanted to be the best, to outshine Carver, and his taunts pushed her too far. It reminds me of Mrs. Elton in my village, who once tried to sabotage a rival's roses out of spite. Lydia's roses were her wine collection, and Carver was the thorn she couldn't bear." "And Gray?" Beatrice asked, her brow furrowing. "What drove him to help her?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Mr. Gray, or Victor Greystone, as we now know, had his own thorns. The police found that Carver had ruined his family's business years ago, a scandal that drove the Greystones from society. Gray saw a chance to settle an old score, and Lydia's plan gave him the means. He thought he could hide behind his alias, but that cigarette case gave him away. It's always the small things, Beatrice, that betray us. Beatrice sighed, setting her cup down with a delicate clink. And poor Tommy Wells, caught in the middle. He's lucky you noticed him, Jane. The police might have thought him guilty if you hadn't pressed for his story. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. Young Tommy was frightened, like a boy in my village who once ran off after seeing something he shouldn't. He didn't mean harm, but he saw too much. Lydia and Gray's exchange, the vial. His fear saved him in a way by leading us to the truth. The conversation paused as a footman entered, carrying a tray with fresh scones and clotted cream. Miss Marple accepted one with a nod of thanks, her mind drifting to the final moments of the case. Inspector Crane had arrested Lydia Harcourt and Victor Gray the previous evening, their confessions drawn out under the weight of the evidence. The strychnine-stained napkin, Tommy's testimony, and the vial found in Gray's room. Lydia had broken first, her polished facade crumbling as she admitted to poisoning Carver's glass, driven by years of humiliation at his hands. Gray, cornered by the vial and his uncovered past, had confessed to supplying the strychnine, believing it would only sicken Carver, not kill him. Their motives, ambition and revenge, had intertwined like vines, choking out their better judgment. The auction had resumed that morning, a subdued affair overseen by a new auctioneer, with the Chateau Lavaux sold to a quiet collector from Devon. Madame Elise Dubois, her reputation intact, had left for France, her pride bruised but unbroken. Percival Thorne, cleared of suspicion, was arranging to settle his debts, his fear replaced by a cautious relief. The manor, though scarred by the scandal, was returning to its rhythm, as if eager to forget. Beatrice leaned forward, her voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "Jane, will you stay a few more days? The house feels lighter with you here, and I could use the company." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes warm but resolute. "You're very kind, Beatrice, but I must get back to St. Mary Mead. My garden needs tending, and I dare say the village has its own little dramas waiting for me. But I'll write, and you must visit when you're next in the country." As they finished their tea, Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag and rose, her movements slow but steady. The manor's halls were quieter now, the guests departing in their sleek cars, the police presence reduced to a single constable at the gate. She paused at the threshold of the morning room, her gaze lingering on the gardens where the roses still bloomed despite the autumn chill. The mystery was solved, the truth laid bare, but Miss Marple felt the familiar pang of melancholy that came with such resolutions. Human nature, she knew, was a tapestry of light and shadow, and she had merely traced its darker threads. As she made her way to her room to pack, she thought of St. Mary Mead, with its tidy cottages and gossiping neighbours. The village was smaller, its dramas less grand, but the hearts that beat there were no different from those at Ashford Manor. Ambition, pride, fear, revenge, they were universal, as constant as the seasons. And Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and sharp eyes, would always be there to unravel them, one careful stitch at a time.